Snow fell in silence over a dying city. The canals of Amsterdam, once alive with the rhythm of bicycles and chatter, had frozen into glass. Beneath that glass, the bodies of fish lay still, a small tragedy in a sea of hunger. It was January 1945, and the people of the Netherlands were starving to death. They called it the Hongerwinter. For those who lived through it, the name was not poetic. It was literal. It was the sound of mothers scraping frost off windows and melting it for water. It was the sight of fathers tearing apart floorboards for firewood. It was the taste of tulip bulbs boiled in desperation, the bitter sap of survival. The war in Europe was nearing its end, but for the Dutch, the final months would be among the in their history. As Allied forces advanced from the south, the northern provinces, including Amsterdam, Rotterdam, and The Hague, remained trapped under Nazi occupation. The German army, retreating and resentful, cut off food and fuel supplies to millions of civilians. It was a punishment, and it worked. By January, the railways had stopped. The power grid had collapsed. People burned books and furniture to keep warm in the endless cold. Entire families huddled in single rooms, trying to survive on a few ounces of bread a day. The official ration in Amsterdam fell to less than 500 calories daily, barely enough to sustain a child. Children's cheeks hollowed, men collapsed in the streets. The city's trams, long since useless, stood still under drifts of snow, and yet somehow life went on. Amid this silent catastrophe, a 12-year-old girl named Van kept a diary. Her handwriting, faint and careful, trembled with hunger. "Today," she wrote, "we boiled the wallpaper from the wall. The paste has flour in it, Mama says. We ate it with a spoon." Her words were not unusual. Across the occupied Netherlands, diaries like hers captured the descent into starvation, each line a record of courage and despair. But the story of the Hongerwinter was not just one of suffering. It was also a story of endurance, of solidarity, and of the quiet heroism of those who refused to surrender their humanity. In the early months of 1945, the Netherlands became a land divided, not just between occupier and occupied, but between those who still believed in salvation and those who no longer did. At the southern edge of the country, Allied forces had liberated Maastricht, Eindhoven, and Tilburg months earlier. Canadian and British troops were slowly pushing northward, their tanks grinding through snow and mud. To the Dutch watching from the other side of the front, liberation was tantalizingly close, close enough to imagine, too far to touch. In Amsterdam, rumors spread like fire. The Allies are coming. The Germans are retreating. Food is on its way. But the weeks passed, and the cold deepened. Hope began to rot like the potatoes that no longer grew. One morning in February's father, a former teacher, joined thousands of others on the hunger trek. With no trains running, people walked for days, 50, sometimes 100 kilometers, toward the eastern countryside where farmers still had grain hidden in barns. Many never returned. German patrols often stopped them on the roads, confiscating their sacks, sending them home empty-handed or worse. In Amsterdam, waited by the window, watching the snow fall, counting days. "Papa went to find food," she wrote. "Mama says we will share when he returns. I am not hungry anymore. I just feel empty." The emptiness she described was more than physical. It was the feeling of a nation being stripped of its identity, its pride, its voice. Yet even in that emptiness, resistance flickered. Underground networks continued to operate, printing illegal newspapers, hiding Jewish children, sabotaging German transport lines. Starving but defiant, the Dutch people still risked everything for the idea of freedom. One of those underground workers was a 24-year-old student from Utrecht who had spent 2 years distributing resistance leaflets. By 1945, he was thin as paper, his cheeks sunken, but his resolve unbroken. He carried messages written on cigarette paper, tucked inside the lining of his jacket. "We are dying," he told a comrade, but not quietly. For the occupiers, quiet was all they wanted. German soldiers patrolled the streets in silence, their faces as gray as the sky. They knew the war was lost, yet they clung to power with the desperation of drowning men. Many were boys themselves, 18, 19, drafted into a crumbling army and ordered to hold the line. They looted what little remained: bread, coal, bicycles. The Dutch watched them with a mix of hatred and pity. Sometimes even pity turned to guilt. One eyewitness, a nurse named, later recalled, "I saw a German soldier steal a loaf of bread from a woman's hand. He ran into an alley and ate it like an animal. For a moment, I forgot the uniform and saw only hunger. By March, starvation had reached its peak. Hospitals filled with the dying, not soldiers but civilians. Doctors recorded cases of edema hunger, where the body swelled grotesquely from malnutrition. Children's bellies bloated. Their hair fell out. Entire classrooms disappeared. And yet, amid the decay, life persisted. Bobbies were still born. Churches still rang bells when fuel allowed. Some families sang to keep warm, soft hymns in candlelight. In a small attic and her mother shared one last loaf of bread. Her father had not returned. Snow drifted through cracks in the roof. "Mama says to eat slowly," she wrote. "I try, but my hands shake." Outside, the sound of distant artillery rumbled, a low, thunderous promise. Somewhere beyond the frozen rivers, Allied tanks were moving. The front was creeping closer. And with it, something else was stirring, the whisper of liberation. But liberation would not come easily. Before the food convoys arrived, before the sky filled with the mercy of parachutes, the people of the Netherlands would endure their darkest days. By April 1945, 1 in every 10 Dutch children in the occupied zone was severely malnourished. Thousands had already died. The canals were no longer frozen, but they were lined with silent processions of bicycles turned into stretchers, the last vehicles of the dying. Still, hope had not vanished entirely. On the first warm day of April, a British reconnaissance plane flew low over Amsterdam. It dropped no bombs, no leaflets, only dipped its wings and disappeared into the clouds. For a city on the brink of death, that single gesture was enough. People came out of their houses, looked up, and wept. The end was near, they could feel it. In the coming weeks, a desperate negotiation between the Allies and the Germans would decide the fate of millions. The plan was audacious: to feed an occupied nation without ending the war too soon. It would involve secret meetings, truce zones, and a fleet of bombers carrying not death but bread. And for the starving children of the Netherlands, for her mother, for those who had survived the winter, salvation would finally come from the sky. By the spring of 1945, the snow had begun to melt, but the hunger did not. The canals thawed into dark water, revealing what the ice had hidden for months: bicycles, crates, the occasional lifeless shape, drifting quietly beneath the surface. The people of the Netherlands were no longer starving in silence. They were waiting for a miracle. Every rumor now sounded like salvation. The Allies are coming. The Germans will surrender soon. Food is on its way. But none of it was certain. The Allied forces, British, Canadian, American, had liberated much of southern Holland. Cities like Eindhoven and Maastricht were free, celebrating with music and flowers. But north of the great rivers, the Waal and the Rhine, the story was different. The Germans still occupied Amsterdam, Rotterdam, The Hague, and Utrecht. The bridges were destroyed, the roads mined, and the people trapped. Worse still, the Germans had flooded vast stretches of farmland to halt the Allied advance. Fields that once fed thousands were now shallow seas of mud and salt water. The land itself had become a weapon. In those cities, the hunger had turned feral. People scavenged for anything that could burn or be eaten. Wallpaper glue, tulip bulbs, sawdust biscuits, and even cats and dogs became food. The once proud people of Amsterdam now pulled carts made from baby carriages and sleds, trading family heirlooms for a handful of potatoes. One survivor, a woman named Van, later recalled, "I ate tulip bulbs for weeks. They were bitter and made my stomach ache, but I told my children it was soup." By April, even the Germans could see what was happening. Starving civilians wandered the streets, collapsing in doorways. Death had become routine. The occupiers had grown desperate themselves, stealing coal, breaking into warehouses, drinking from rivers. Yet somewhere in this despair, diplomacy found a way. At the Allied headquarters in Brussels, a Canadian officer named Lieutenant General Charles was briefed on a daring idea. The plan came directly from General Eisenhower's command and carried the cautious approval of Prime Minister Churchill. It was simple in theory, impossible in practice. A truce between enemies, not to stop fighting, but to feed civilians. It was called Operation Manna. The concept was unheard of. Allied bombers, which had spent years raining destruction on occupied Europe, would now fly over German-controlled territory, unarmed, and drop food instead of explosives. It was an act of mercy in the middle of war. But first, there had to be an agreement. In late April 1945, representatives from both sides met secretly at the Dutch village of. On one side of the table sat General and Air Commodore of the Royal Air Force. On the other sat German General, commander of the remaining occupation forces in the Netherlands, a man loyal to, but not blind to reality. The meeting was tense. Allied officers demanded safe passage for the bombers. The Germans hesitated. A single nervous soldier, a wrong signal, or a trigger-happy flak gun could turn a humanitarian mission into a massacre. Finally agreed. "We will not fire," he said. "The people are dying, we will not stop this." And so the skis over Holland, once symbols of fear, would become the path to life. On the morning of April 29, 1945, the first Lancaster bombers of the Royal Air Force thundered into the sky. Their bellies, once filled with bombs, now carried sacks of flour, tins of milk, sugar, butter, and biscuits. Each aircraft carried nearly 7 tons of food. Their mission, to drop it over specific zones marked by white sheets on the ground, airfields, race tracks, open parks, anywhere large enough to receive the precious cargo. The first drop zone was near The Hague. As the Lancasters roared overhead, thousands of starving Dutch citizens ran from their houses, waving towels, flags, and even. One of them was 12-year-old. She stood with her mother in an open field near Amsterdam, staring at the low hum that grew louder, closer. "It sounded like thunder," she would later recall. "Then we saw them, the planes, hundreds of them. They were shining like angels." The bomb bay doors opened, and for the first time in 5 years, the sky rained mercy. Canvas sacks tumbled down like snow, bursting on impact, wheat, chocolate, margarine, powdered eggs. Children screamed and laughed. Men wept openly. A woman fell to her knees, clutching a piece of bread to her chest as if it were gold. And her mother gathered what they could, crushed biscuits, sugar grains, a torn sack of flour. They carried it home like treasure, baking small loaves that tasted, in her words, like heaven. The operation continued for days. Hundreds of bombers from the Royal Air Force and the U.S. Army Air Forces joined the effort. The Americans called their mission Operation Chowhound. Between April 29 and May 8, nearly 11,000 tons of food were dropped over the western Netherlands. But it wasn't without risk. The planes had to fly dangerously low, barely 400 feet above the ground, to ensure accuracy. Many crews reported seeing German soldiers below, rifles slung over shoulders, watching silently as the Allied bombers passed. One British pilot later said, "We could see their faces. They waved at us. It was the strangest moment of the war enemies feeding each other's civilians." For the Dutch, it was nothing short of miraculous. Van described it best. "I stood in my doorway and saw the sky filled with planes. I forgot my hunger. I forgot my fear. I felt alive again." In Amsterdam, children ran through the streets shouting, "The food angels have come." Others called it, "the bread from heaven." Even as the drops continued, the front lines shifted. Canadian forces pushed northward, liberating city after city. The Germans, seeing their defeat inevitable, began to withdraw. But every day mattered. Even with the food drops, thousands continued to die of starvation or exhaustion. For many, the relief came too late. Hospitals filled with those who couldn't digest the sudden return of real food. Malnourished bodies, weakened by months of deprivation, could not handle bread or butter. Doctors rationed even salvation carefully, spoon by spoon. Yet hope had returned. For the first time in months, the Dutch flag began to reappear, hidden banners brought out from attics, sewn together from scraps. The orange of the Royal House of Nassau fluttered again in windows. And still the bombing missions continued, every day until the war itself ended. On May 5, 1945, after 5 years of occupation, the Netherlands was officially liberated. German forces surrendered to Canadian General in the town of. That same night, church bells rang across the country for the first time in years. People poured into the streets, frail, thin, but free. Stood with her mother in Dam Square holding a small Dutch flag. She had survived. Around her, people sang the national anthem, hoarse voices, trembling but defiant. But liberation was not without cost. Just 2 days later, a tragedy struck when a group of celebrating civilians in Amsterdam was fired upon by remaining German troops. 22 people were killed. Even in freedom, the scars of occupation lingered. Yet amid the mourning, the nation stood united. The nightmare of the Hongerwinter was over. The people who had endured starvation, fear, and humiliation had lived to see dawn. As the food convoys rolled in, the bombers made one final pass, low, steady, and silent. Pilots waved from cockpits as children below waved back, their arms thin but strong. The air was filled with the smell of bread, diesel, and spring. The war was ending, but for the Netherlands, healing had only just begun. In the months ahead, they would reckon with the trauma, the losses, and the memories that hunger had carved into their bones. And the children who had survived, among them, would carry those memories for the rest of their lives. The war had ended, but the silence it left behind was heavier than the hunger that came before it. On the morning of May 6, 1945, the people of Amsterdam awoke to a city that no longer belonged to Germany, yet not entirely to themselves either. Liberation, after years of deprivation, felt almost unreal, a kind of fragile dream that might shatter if they spoke too loudly. Everywhere people emerged from hiding. Flags appeared from windows, orange banners fluttered over rooftops, and the bells rang for the first time since 1940. Children, barefoot and thin, ran into the streets, chasing the echo of freedom. Soldiers from the Canadian Army entered the city in long convoys, smiling, waving, throwing chocolate and cigarettes from their trucks. The Dutch greeted them not with cheers of victory, but with tears. Van stood with her mother at the corner of it, holding a paper flag. She was 12 years old but looked 9, a pale shadow of the child she once was. Her dress hung loose on her frame, her hair brittle and dull. Yet her eyes, once hollow, now glimmered with something that had almost disappeared from the city, hope. The Canadians were astonished at what they saw. Lieutenant of the 1st Canadian Army wrote in his diary, "We expected joy, and there was joy, but beneath it there was something else, exhaustion so deep it hurt to look at. These people have suffered beyond imagination. They smile, but their faces are carved with hunger." For the Dutch, the end of the war was not the end of suffering. It was the beginning of remembering. The first weeks of peace were chaotic. German soldiers, now prisoners, were rounded up and marched through the streets they once patrolled. Collaborators were arrested by the hundreds, members of the Dutch Nazi Party, informants and profiteers. Some were beaten by angry mobs, others were simply spat on. Dutch women accused of relationships with German soldiers, the so-called, had their heads shaved in public squares, paraded as symbols of shame. Saw it happen one afternoon outside the post office. "They cut her hair," she later wrote in her diary, "and people laughed, but I didn't, I just wanted to go home." The hunger had taught her not to judge, only to endure. In the following months, food from the Allies poured in bread, powdered milk, cheese, flour, even chocolate. The Red Cross established kitchens in every major city. Lines stretched for blocks as people waited patiently for soup, their bowls and tin cups clutched like sacred objects. The average adult had lost more than 20 pounds during the winter. Children, stunted by malnutrition, looked like fragile porcelain dolls. Doctors warned that many would suffer lifelong effects, brittle bones, heart problems, and infertility. But at that moment, survival itself felt like a miracle. One doctor at the Amsterdam University Hospital wrote, "I have treated the wounded and the sick, but the starved are something else. They are not merely ill, they are emptied, erased, as if their bodies forgot how to live." And yet the children began to play again. They kicked tin cans through alleys, built makeshift toys out of wood scraps, and waited for Allied soldiers to pass by so they could beg for gum and chocolate. Remembered one soldier, a tall Canadian with sandy hair, who gave her a chocolate bar wrapped in silver foil. "He smiled," she said years later, "and told me I was safe now. I ate that chocolate so slowly I made it last for 3 days." For many Dutch children, it was the first real food they had eaten in months. But not all scars were visible. Families searched for missing loved ones, fathers who never returned from labor camps, brothers who vanished in the resistance, children who were taken away because they were Jewish. The Hongerwinter had not been an isolated tragedy. It was the final chapter in 5 years of horror. In Amsterdam alone, more than 100,000 Dutch Jews had been deported. Only a few thousand survived. The empty houses in the Jewish quarter stood like ghosts, their windows boarded, their silence unbearable. One by one, the survivors began to return. They came back to cities that no longer recognized them, homes occupied by strangers, names erased from doorbells. Among them were children who had been hidden during the war by Dutch families, raised under false names to protect them from the Nazis. Now in peace, they were told who they really were, and sometimes that their parents were gone forever. A social worker in The Hague described the heartbreak of those reunions. A child of 6 came to us. She had lived as a Christian girl for 3 years. When we told her she was Jewish, she said, "Then where is my mama?" And we had no answer. For the Dutch nation, liberation was not only about freedom, it was about facing what had been lost. Still, amid the mourning, something remarkable happened. In the summer of 1945, Allied soldiers and Dutch citizens worked together to rebuild roads, railways, schools, and hospitals. The same cities that had been frozen tombs in winter now buzzed with life. Amsterdam's canals filled again with boats. Farmers from the liberated south brought vegetables and milk to the starving north. Markets reopened, the smell of bread and cheese returning to the streets like a long-lost friend. But for every loaf of bread, there was a reminder of those who never tasted it. In August, a memorial service was held in Amsterdam's Dam Square to honor those who had died during the Hongerwinter. Thousands attended, men, women, and children standing silently as a single bell tolled. Among them was holding her mother's hand. The speaker, a Dutch pastor who had risked his life in the resistance, said quietly into the microphone, "We have survived, but not all who lived are alive. We must remember not only the dead, but the hunger that nearly consumed us." That sentence, "the hunger that nearly consumed us," became part of the nation's collective memory. In the months that followed, scientists and doctors studied the effects of the famine on children. What they discovered would echo for generations. They found that those who were in the womb during the winter, babies conceived or born in 1945, carried the physical and psychological scars of starvation throughout their lives. They grew smaller, developed chronic illnesses more often, and even there would be affected. It was called the Dutch famine birth cohort, and decades later, their suffering would help scientists understand how trauma and deprivation could alter human DNA itself. But in 1945, such discoveries were far away. For now, there was only the living rebuilding their lives, one meal at a time. Children went back to school, streets filled with the noise of bicycles once more. And every spring thereafter, when the first tulips bloomed, the people of the Netherlands remembered the bulbs they had once eaten. A bitter reminder turned into a symbol of rebirth. For and thousands like her, childhood had ended too soon. But the memory of survival became her strength. She kept her wartime diary, its pages yellowed and stained, as a testament to endurance. In one of her last entries, written in June 1945, she wrote, "I am not hungry anymore. I feel the sun again. When I eat bread now, I thank the sky." The Hongerwinter had ended, but its echo lingered in bodies, in soil, in memory. And from that echo, a nation rebuilt itself, not out of vengeance or hatred, but out of a shared vow. Never again. The years after liberation unfolded like the slow thaw after an endless frost. The Netherlands, starved but unbroken, began the long, painful journey toward life again. What the bombs had not destroyed, hunger nearly had. Yet amid the ruins, something extraordinary began to grow, a quiet, stubborn hope. By the autumn of 1945, the Dutch landscape looked almost the same as it had before the war, windmills turning over green fields, canals glinting under a pale sun. But the people were not the same. They carried the war inside them. Doctors in Amsterdam hospitals saw it daily, the aftershocks of hunger. Children's growth had slowed. Adults who had survived on tulip bulbs and watery soup now suffered heart problems, brittle bones, and damaged kidneys. Women who had starved during pregnancy gave birth to infants so small they could fit in the palm of a hand. Entire families shared one loaf of bread in celebration, but even joy was cautious, fragile, new. And yet from that same soil of deprivation, compassion began to bloom. The Canadians who had liberated the Netherlands stayed for months, helping to distribute food, rebuild roads, and comfort the grieving. Soldiers slept in barns, worked alongside Dutch farmers, and shared their rations. Friendships were forged in the ruins. Some never ended. A Canadian private named Arthur wrote home to his wife, "I have never seen gratitude like this. They are thin as reeds, these people, but when you give them bread, they look at you as though you handed them the world." Children followed the soldiers everywhere. To them, these men were giants from another planet, laughing, strong, generous. For many Dutch families, the Canadians became symbols of kindness that transcended war. Even decades later, when those same soldiers returned as old men for remembrance ceremonies, the Dutch greeted them with tears and tulips. In 1946, the tulip became the symbol of rebirth and of thanks. The Dutch government sent 100,000 tulip bulbs to Canada as a gift for their role in liberation. Every spring, those tulips bloom in Ottawa, a living reminder of the bond born from hunger and mercy. But at home, the Dutch still faced ghosts. Cities like Rotterdam were almost unrecognizable. The bombings of 1940 had leveled much of the city, and the Hongerwinter had stripped it bare. Amsterdam, though spared from heavy bombing, was hollowed by loss. Whole neighborhoods stood abandoned, their windows shattered, their walls blackened by soot. The Jewish quarter, once alive with laughter and music, was silent. The people returned to fill those silences with life again. Brick by brick, they rebuilt what had been taken from them. Shops reopened, barges returned to the canals, and the first post-war children were born, thin but alive. Among those children were the youngest survivors of the Hongerwinter. They would become known, in time, as the children of the famine. They carried in their bodies a story science would one day tell, a story written not in ink, but in genes. Decades later, Dutch researchers studying the famine's survivors made a discovery that shocked the world. They found that those who had been conceived or born during the Hongerwinter carried higher risks of heart disease, diabetes, and depression. Their children, and even bore traces of that trauma too. The Hongerwinter had left its fingerprints not only on memory, but on DNA. It was one of the first pieces of evidence of what we now call epigenetics, the idea that trauma can be passed from one generation to the next. The children of the famine had inherited more than their parents' resilience. They had inherited their pain. And yet the Netherlands did not allow that pain to define it. It chose to transform it. The war had taught them the cost of silence, the fragility of freedom, and the power of compassion. The very people who had endured starvation became some of the first to champion international humanitarian aid. In the years that followed, the Dutch sent food, doctors, and resources to war-torn countries across Europe. They remembered what it felt like to wait for bread that never came, and they vowed that no one else would have to. Even the children who had once stared at empty plates found ways to give back. Van, the girl who had boiled wallpaper paste to survive, grew up to become a teacher. She spent her life educating others about the Hongerwinter, not through bitterness, but through empathy. In one of her final interviews before her death in 1999, she said, "I tell my students that hunger is not only the absence of food, it is the absence of kindness. We must never let either return." Her diary, rediscovered after her death, was donated to the Dutch National Archives. Its fragile pages, brown, smudged, and stained, became part of a traveling exhibit titled "The Winter We Endured." Visitors still stop to read her words. "I am not hungry anymore, but I remember." Every spring, the Netherlands honors those who did not survive. On May 4th at exactly 8:00 p.m., the entire country falls silent for 2 minutes. Trains stop, radios pause, streets freeze. Only the sound of wind and birds remains. 2 minutes for 5 years of suffering. And on May 5th, the next day, they celebrate Liberation Day, the day the bread finally fell from the sky. Cities fill with flags and music. Children wave the same red, white, and blue banners that once marked freedom in 1945. In Amsterdam, near Dam Square, a monument stands tall, a white stone obelisk known as the National Monument on the Dam. At its base are carved words in Dutch that translate roughly to, "Here, where the heart of the fatherland is, may this monument remind us of those who gave their lives for our freedom." Each year, veterans lay wreaths there. Each year, new generations of Dutch children who have never known war bow their heads in silence. And each year, the memory of the Hongerwinter lives on, not as a wound, but as a warning. Because it was not only a tragedy of war, but a test of humanity. In those frozen months of 1944 and 1945, when hope itself seemed to starve, it was kindness, small, quiet, fragile kindness, that kept the Dutch alive. A farmer giving a stranger half a potato, a mother sharing her last crust of bread, a pilot risking his life to drop food instead of bombs. In the end, those moments were the difference between life and death. As one survivor later wrote, "We learned that freedom is not just the end of war, it is the presence of compassion." And so, when the tulips bloom each spring, bright, defiant, rising from the same soil that once froze with hunger, They carry a message written in petals and memory alike. Never forget what it costs to be free. Never forget what it means to be human. The hunger winter ended, but the lesson remains.